thank you, all of you, for being here and making out the time to listen to my presentation. I would like to first thank Christoph and Helmut, for this great opportunity in the RCC. I think that I've been here for about 6 months, but what I've achieved in 6 months in this place, I wouldn't achieve it in 2 years in Nigeria. So I must really let them know that I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I've also had the opportunity of meeting very nice and lovely and very helpful scholars here and students. And so I'm very happy to have met all of you. And although I still have a few months here, but I think that anybody who's coming here newly should know that you're definitely you're in the best place to achieve whatever you want to do academically. So today I'm talking about gender and climate change, and I'm actually looking at the adaptation and resilience of women in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. And this is based on my research, which I did in 2012 in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. And some of you may ask, where's the Niger Delta region? First, you can see from the map there that Nigeria is in the western part of Africa, and those areas under here make up the Niger Delta region. Nigeria is made up of 36 states, and the Niger Delta region constitute 9 states make up the Niger Delta region. So what is the Niger Delta region, and what's so important about this region? First, let me give you a background to the Niger Delta region, because I think it's important so you know where I'm coming from. As a background to the study, the Niger Delta region has been the mainstay of the Nigerian economy due to oil production from that region. And this region is characterized by immense poverty. I come from the Niger Delta region. And this region has also suffered from a long history of socio-economic neglect and environmental degradation, such as oil pollution from the multinational companies operating in that region. And thus, the paradox of the Niger Delta is that of a region rich in natural resources, but with significant percentage of its population living below the poverty line. The majority of the population live on less than $1 in a day. So that's the paradox of the Niger Delta region. This situation over the years has led to serious incidents of conflict and violence and violent protests by the poor people of this region. The human, social, economic, and financial implications cannot be overemphasized. On the one hand, lives and properties are lost. On the other hand, the multinational companies make revenue losses due to vandalism of their equipment and disruption in their production. The conflict in the Niger Delta has remained one of the most intractable conflicts in the history of Nigeria. The oil-rich Niger Delta in the south of the country remains the scene of recurring violence between members of the different ethnic groups competing for political and economic power, and between militias and security forces sent to restore order in that region. Well, against the backdrop of insecurity, conflict, and violence pervasive in the Niger Delta region, the people also have to contend with the recurring problem of climate variability and climate change. Nigeria as a country has only 2 seasons. We have the dry season and rainy season. So it's not like where you have summer, autumn, and all the rest spring. So it's either very dry, or it's either very wet, or it's either very hot, or it's a bit never too cold. So, and because of during rainy seasons, we have this issue of flash floods, but these flash floods sometimes can be intense. And especially the rural people, like rural areas, because they have poor drainage systems, they are always, affected by flooding. So in 2012, we had one of our worst major floodings in July 2012, and I was actually in the rural area at that time, and I just managed to escape, but I had to come back after the flooding to find out how the people survived and how they coped, because I couldn't even cope. I couldn't survive. I had to escape. So here's their story. So the impact of climate change increases, we all know, increases livelihood vulnerability of the rural farming household in this region. Climate change makes access to food resources unpredictable and increases poverty and disease. Women bear the brunt of all these and the resulting impacts of climate change. Women in this region constitute the most vulnerable group since they have limited access to land through kinship relations. They can access land through their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their fathers, but not with their own names. Education and modernity is seeing the changing trend of this phenomenon as more and more women, through education and empowerment, are beginning to break this cycle and are being able to buy their own lands. I am a beneficiary of such a breaking tradition, but sadly, only very few women are able to overcome such challenges. Studies on climate variability and changes in Nigeria have been carried out, but there still exists a gap in knowledge on the impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable groups, especially the poor women in rural Nigeria, and how they adapt using their indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is the local knowledge that is unique to a given culture or society. Indigenous knowledge contrasts with the international knowledge system generated by universities, research institutes, and private firms. It is the basis for local level decision making in agriculture, healthcare, food preparation, education, natural resource management, and a host of other activities in rural communities. In this presentation, I use the word indigenous, traditional, and local interchangeably to mean the same thing. When I speak about indigenous people, I refer to a group of people who have settled in a territory or region over a long period of time and have distinct languages, cultures, beliefs, socioeconomic and political system, and are accepted by all the other members of that group as their own. Such persons are regarded as natives of that territory or region. So, now, let's move on to the statement of the problem. The issue of climate change, according to the United Nations Development Programme, magnifies already existing inequalities, especially gender inequality. Gender inequality puts women and girls especially at risk or makes them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. For example, as I earlier mentioned, the rural people's livelihood activities are land-related, and yet women have access to land only through marriage or kinship. They do not have access title to the land, which results in vulnerability. Feminization of poverty theory as an institutional approach draws attention to the fact that deprivation is experienced differently by women and men, girls and boys. Poverty is experienced more severely by poor women than poor men, with the resultant feminization of poverty due to less access to food, education, and healthcare, unequal inheritance rights, lack of equal opportunities, and so on. As people whose livelihood activities are land or agriculturally related, agriculture in the Niger Delta is highly dependent on rain, as irrigation is seldom practiced. The changes in the rainfall pattern have greatly affected vegetation and agriculture. Often in research, it is wrongly assumed that rural and indigenous women do not offer scientific knowledge, even though in many communities in the Niger Delta, they are the caretakers of biodiversity and experts in herbal medicines, farm and forest management, water conservation, food storages, and so on. Women have an in-depth knowledge of the type and ecosystems which surround them. In agriculture, women are often involved in all phases of farming, from seed selection and planting to harvesting, weeding, and storing grain. They are often the local educators, passing on traditional knowledge. Rural women's leadership in addressing climate change is taking many forms that can be built on and extended. The social gender roles assigned to men and women has impacts and will determine how severe the impacts of climate change will be felt by both men and women. Climate change is likely to increase the amount of time it would normally take the members of a household to do a job. For example, if you look at the picture on the screen, you will see a woman fetching water. And you can see that that place where she's fetching water is not a river or a stream, but it's where water is coming from somewhere. And she has to use a container to kind of sieve the water from the sand. And you know, normally that would take a longer time than if it was a river, a clean river, or she'll just put her bucket and lift it and put on her head and walk away. So these are some of the problems. And of course, it's a woman that's fetching the water, not the man. Excuse me. Okay. When confronted with the problems associated with climate change, the people of this region respond to the situation by developing coping strategies on an individual and on a collective level. How do rural people respond to and adapt to the changes in their livelihood base using local knowledge are some of the questions my research intended to answer. Specifically, the study examined how women, who are the most vulnerable and marginalized group, adapt and respond to climate change using their local knowledge in spite of the obvious gender inequality pervasive in the society. In Nigeria, women make up 60 to 80% of the agricultural force, and they produce 2/3 of the food crops. The Nigerian society is patriarchal by nature, and within these patriarchal systems, men and women have historically had different access to power and resources, with Nigerian women living with customary systems that dominate and subjugate them. Due to the gender roles ascribed by the society, women are assigned certain duties even in farming. Table 1 above shows that more women are engaging in planting, sowing, and marketing, whereas the men are engaged in more intensive activities such as land clearing and stumping. Women in the Niger Delta, especially women in the rural areas, are assigned roles of caring for the household domestically, and this includes providing for the family subsistence. As hardworking and industrious women, they engage in subsistence farming, small-scale marketing of fish, farm produce, and sale of firewood. Despite their limitations, the women in this region have found ways to cope and adapt to the ever-changing climate situations in their region in order to eke out a living and to provide food for their children by using their indigenous knowledge and experiences. So, in doing this research, I did focus group discussion in 3 different states in Niger Delta, which is the River State, Delta State, and Bayelsa State. And we talked to both men and we talked to both women. And I felt the only way we could really show the impact of climate change on the people's livelihood is to, use a model. And here I've decided to use the DFID's Department of International Development Sustainable Livelihood Framework. And so if you look at this, the drawing on the wall, you will see here is climate change, here is the vulnerability context, and you have the 5 capitals human, social, physical, financial, and natural capitals. So like I said, the study uses the DFID Sustainable Livelihood Framework approach in exploring the impacts of climate change on the unit of analysis, which is the farming household. This approach is used because it looks at where people are, what they have, and their needs and interests. It's an ideal type model framework on how the farming household ekes out a living while at the same time maintaining its assets for future sustenance despite the problems in their environment. As opposed to regarding the rural farmer as a passive recipient of nature, the livelihood framework recognizes her as an actor with assets and capabilities which enables her to pursue her livelihood components and how they relate to the desired outcome, that is, their livelihood security. The human capitals include the health status of household members, education, knowledge, and skills, capacity to work and capacity to adapt for the people of Niger Delta region. One of the consequences of rising water levels associated with climate change is an increase in waterborne diseases which has implications for the health of the rural household. Other health consequences of climate change include higher rates of malnutrition due to food shortages. Traditional gender roles also result in climate change having a disproportionate impact on the lives of women and girls. Women carry the burden of caring for ill people in the household, while at the same time they attempt to secure livelihoods for their households. The natural capitals include land and produce, water and aquatic resources, trees and forest products, wildlife, wild foods and fibers, biodiversity and environmental resources. The destruction of marine habitats may undermine livelihoods based on fishing and other marine resources, thus increasing poverty and food insecurity. The physical capitals include infrastructure such as transport, roads, bicycles, secure shelter and buildings, water supply and sanitation, energy, farm tools and equipment. Of course, when there's flooding, there is no roads. The financial capitals include savings, credit and debit, formal and informal, NGOs, remittances, pensions, and wages. Due to gender inequality, women are not often regarded as likely candidates for credit loans because they do not have any form of collateral, such as land and properties. And in times of financial problems, they do not have any resources to use as financial backup. The social capitals includes but not limited to social networks and connections, patronage, neighborhoods, kinship relations of trust and mutual support, formal and informal groups, common rules and sanctions, etc. In order to meet the rising cost of living due to climate change and related events, households rely on social networks such as extended family and cash in their savings, and assets such as livestock and jewelry. When disposing of their assets, households will try to preserve those that are productive, such as land and farm implements, as long as possible to safeguard the future survival of the household. Households with more financial, physical, and social assets are better able to cope with the adverse effects of climate change, whereas poor, often female-headed households experience difficulty in absorbing the shock caused by climate change. The indigenous people in the Niger Delta region are not mere victims of the impact of climate change in their environment. Here, I don't know if it's clear enough, you can see this is based on information from the focus group discussion. You can see that these are some of the coping strategies, and I made the table in such a way you see the men, the way they respond, and the way the women respond. And you find out that the men, almost all the time, whenever there's a problem that has to do with their livelihood, if their livelihood is affected, especially if it has to do with climate change related events, they would migrate and they leave the women behind to cope. The women, on the other hand, have to find ways of surviving. Very few of them have the opportunities to migrate. Well, the good news is that when the men migrate and they get jobs, they probably sometimes they send back remittances to the woman to take care of the children and the elderly and people in their household. So, in cases like this, for example, when there's waterborne diseases or diseases like malaria, the women, through their knowledge, know the kind of herbs they can use to treat these diseases, which, I don't know if anybody here has ever experienced a situation whereby, let's say, if there's flooding. Has anybody experienced that before? Where it's a horrible situation, you cannot move from here to even the next building if there's water everywhere. So the people can't even move from their homes to any hospital if there's anyone close by. And so they have to find ways of treating themselves, and they have their own knowledge that I don't know the science behind it. I don't know how they know it and how it works, but it works. For example, when in treating malaria, they use a plant called dogoyaro in treating malaria, and till today, some people in Nigeria, when they have used all the normal medicines that the medical board says this should be used to treat malaria, and when it doesn't work, they now end up using these herbs. And dogoyaro, I found out that the scientific name is actually a neem tree. It's a tree which, you use it to treat malaria and many other diseases. And currently I heard that particular plant is a tree actually, is now being considered by United States as a plant that can be used even for pest control. But the indigenous people know this. And one thing about this tree I discovered is that it's so big, so stocky, and the roots are so, sunk into the ground that I think it only take a hurricane or a tornado to pull that tree, uproot that tree. If it's flooding, it won't uproot it. So it's there, it's cheap, it's free, and it's useful to the people. And there are some other plants like that. The women know the exact plants to use to treat high blood pressure, to treat skin diseases, etc. and etc. In terms of when you have floodings, of course, the waters are not good. They have to look for places where they can get clean water to use. The women know where to go to, how deep to dig a well to get the type of water that they need, and some of these are the kind of knowledge that they have. But because of time, I cannot go so deep into everything here. So like I said earlier, the people in this region are not mere victims of the impact of climate change in their environment, but they are victors in their fight for survival in extreme conditions. This is because they use their knowledge of the environment and the experience with the environment in mitigating the impacts of climate change in their daily lives. Since the impacts of climate change is a gendered experience, the response and coping strategies of the various sexes, which is controlled by the culture of the society, determines the differential gendered responses of the indigenous people to climate change. In conclusion, in the emerging global knowledge economy, a country's ability to build and mobilize knowledge capital is equally essential for sustainable development as the availability of physical and financial capital. The basic component of any country's knowledge system is its indigenous knowledge. It encompasses the skills, experiences, and insights of people applied to maintain or improve their livelihood. Sadly, women have not been afforded an equal opportunity to participate in decision-making related to adaptation and mitigation policies and initiatives at the local, national, and international level related to climate change. Women as powerful agents of change and their involvement in policy making are very important. They have always been leaders in community revitalization and natural resource managers. You can see from this picture, this man here was one of our former Minister for Environment, and I think they were in a meeting when they were discussing climate change issues in Nigeria, and I didn't see any woman there. So, the Sustainable Livelihood Framework can be used in identifying locally relevant resilience building options. Obviously, women have a lot of knowledge and experience in dealing with the impacts of climate change, as can be seen from their coping strategies. Mainstreaming alleviation and adaptation strategies from indigenous knowledge into sustainable development is an important task that should be taken into serious consideration. Due to the rapidly changing natural environment and fast-pacing economic, political, and cultural changes on a global scale, many indigenous knowledge systems are at risk of being extinct. Many indigenous practices are disappearing only because of the intrusion of foreign technologies or development concepts that promise short-term gains or solutions to problems without being capable of sustaining them. The tragedy of the impending disappearance of indigenous knowledge is most obvious to those who have developed it and making a living through it. But the implication for others can be detrimental as well. When skills, technologies, artifacts, problem-solving strategies, and expertise are lost. I will end this presentation with this saying that says, resilience in the face of change is embedded in indigenous knowledge and know-how, diversified resources and livelihoods, social institutions and networks, and cultural values and attitudes.